It shows us, in a nutshell, the big changes during the time and how they affected people's everyday life, especially because football is so popular in the East and in the West.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, you're listening to the Transformative Podcast, this time with me, Jelena Đurejnović. Today we are talking about East German football during the Wende, the period around German reunification. My guest today is Jan Mohnhaupt, journalist and historian. After a series of books that focused on the history of animals, his new book, Der geteilte Rasen, Fußball in den Wendejahren, or in English, The Divided Pitch, Football During the Transformation Years, tells the story about how the clubs, players and fans in East Germany experienced the time between 1989 and 92, surrounding the fall of the Berlin Wall, reunification of Germany, and of course, reunification of the Bundesliga. Hi, Jan, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for your invitation.
So, how did the clubs and the football or sport authorities deal with the multiple crises leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall? How did they face this prospect of reunification?
Let's say very belated. During the summer 1989, the Football Association of the GDR, the so-called Deutscher Fußballverband, DFV, declared the football players of the first division, the Oberliga, as professionals. Until then, they were seen as state amateurs, but that hasn't been realistic any longer because even the state and party leader Erich Honecker conceded in February 1989 that the players of the Oberliga were in effect professional footballers. And I think this was a belated adjustment to changing realities, but international transfers remained a taboo. And that was, in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes because that led to big pressure. Because for the top players of the GDR, there was no bigger aim to reach than playing in the European Cup or to travel with the national team through the world. And therefore, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of them took their first chance to go to Western clubs.
What about the other side? How did the West German Football Association handle, or as you argue in the book, even profit from the reunification and the sudden expansion in terms of course, clubs, players, and finally supporters?
Well, the clubs of the Bundesliga and the West German FA, the DFB, Deutsche Fußballbund, they weren't interested in new rivals. The Bundesliga wasn't such a cash cow which it is today. The number of spectators had decreased in the 80s, and the DFB had decided to downsize the Bundesliga from 18 to 16 participants. And in these plans, there was no place for the Eastern clubs. But however, there was a big interest in the best players. And during the first months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, approximately 150 players from the East went to Western clubs, were transferred to Western clubs. And that was a very big, huge loss for the teams, and because only a few and mediocre players took the other way, so from west to east. To mention the officials, both football associations had very, very different expectations what should happen after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The DFV wanted to rescue its dying clubs and integrate them into the system of the Western DFB, of the Bundesliga, and especially the president of the DFV, the newly elected Hans-Georg Moldenhauer from Magdeburg. He wanted to bring the clubs very fast into the other system, and I think he said after his election in March 1990, the shorter I am president, the better I have worked.
Okay, so we have in this context Bundesliga that's actually trying to cut down the number of the clubs, but at the same time we have the reunification of Germany where the number of football clubs is naturally growing. What happens then with East German clubs in this context?
They made an agreement, and we can discuss if it was fair or not. But they had very different expectations. As I said, the DFB wanted to, and you said it too, cut down the Bundesliga. And the DFB, and especially Moldenhauer, he wanted to put all 14 teams of the Oberliga into the Bundesliga. And he had the idea of a so-called Deutschlandliga, which would combine both leagues. And after long decision, they finally made the agreement that there would be 20 clubs, and from the 20 clubs, 2 clubs came from the Oberliga, and 6 teams from the Oberliga would come to the second Bundesliga. So in the second league, 8 teams included from the eastern part.
What about fans or supporters? In your book, you talk a lot about the problems of violence, riots, anti-Semitism, racism in the stands that really marked the stadium terraces in the GDR in this period and a bit before that. But if you look at the 80s, it was not much different in the West, more broadly, or across the East in that period.
Yeah.
So is there something that makes the GDR context different in this regard, if so?
Yeah, indeed, there was much violence on the terraces in East and in West Germany in the late 80s. But the biggest difference, in my opinion, was the reigning power of the police. During that time, when the former Volkspolizei of the GDR was no longer in force and the Western police hadn't taken over yet, there was a kind of legal vacuum all over Eastern Germany. And the pent-up violence erupted, and that led to several riots around the stadiums almost every match day in 1990 and in 1991. And the sad low point of this development surely was the death of the young East Berlin fan Mike Polley in November 1990, who was shot by policemen in Leipzig just before a football match. And that happened just before the accession of the Eastern FA, the DFB, to the DFB.
And if we talk about the present day, what would you say are the legacies of this period of Die Wende years in German football today?
Well, I think that depends on who we are focusing. I think for many East German players and talents, it was an opportunity to play in bigger Western clubs or even make a big career in Europe. For example, Matthias Sammer and Andreas Thom or Thomas Doll, they make big careers and have won titles and played in the national team, the DFB Auswahl. But also youth players or young talents like Steffen Freund or Michael Ballack. For them, the Wende was also a great opportunity because they could reach higher levels in a unified Germany. But I think for the most clubs, it was a very deep incision because they lost their best players, they lost their old sponsors, and they were confronted with a new economic system. And I think it's no wonder that there are only a few clubs from the East in the first and second league today. Only 3 when we don't count RB Leipzig, which is not a classic East German club because it's made of the money of a billionaire and only could reach this level, with billions of money from Red Bull.
Yeah, that would be an East German club only in geographic terms, I guess.
Exactly.
Red Bull Leipzig. Yeah. And finally, as a historian, what would you say that the lens of football can tell us about the transformation years in Germany and in the GDR more specifically?
Well, that's a good question. I think it shows us, in a nutshell, the big changes during the time and how they affected people's everyday life, and especially because football is so popular in the East and in the West, and was also popular in these times. It practically invites to comparison, because football's history in both parts was split off for 4 decades. So there are different stories to be told, and after all this time, there are still some small differences, whether in the way of supporting or chanting, or in several icons or behaviors on the terraces. But in comparison, the football gives us a big and, I think, detailed picture of contemporary history in Germany.
And before we finish, I would like us to reflect on the place of women's football in all this, because we did discuss this outside of this episode, and I think this is also, if we look at broader histories of football in state socialism and football and the fall of state socialism, this is often the perspective that's missing. I mean, the perspective of sport history and football history is missing from histories of state socialism still significantly. But then, in this context, we rarely hear about women's football. So, what would you say on that?
Yeah, it's a very it's like terra incognita a bit. I think it wasn't well developed. It wasn't very well developed in that time, and it wasn't very much supported by the officials too, because women's football wasn't an Olympic sport, and though it had only little prestige in the GDR, and women have played official matches since the late 60s, but not until the late 70s a national championship was held for the first time. And during the time we are speaking about, the late 80s, it was a time when the West German squad just had become European champions. During that time, in the 1989, an East German women's football team was launched, but it played only one game against Czechoslovakia in 1990, and they lost 0-3, and then it was over. Its history was over before it really could get started. It took some time until East German clubs could reach the top, for example, and especially Turbine Potsdam became one of the top teams in Germany and also in Europe in the 1990s and after the millennium. And I think this was a very good example for the women's football in Germany. And yes, I think Turbine Potsdam was for over 1 decade one of the top teams and the highlights, and also yes, a good example for successful sports development in Eastern Germany.
Thank you, Jan, for talking to me today. This brings us to the end of our conversation. And thank you all, of course, for listening to us. This was the Transformative Podcast with me, Jelena Đurejnović, and Jan Mohnhaupt.